Well, and a gracious hello to you wherever you happen to be today. I am Michael Hinkson, and you are listening to Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. And it's deliberately called that, as I've explained a few times before, because most of the time when people talk about diversity, they never talk about disabilities. They talk about sexual orientation and gender and race and so on. But disabilities get left out. In fact, I talked to one person on this podcast who said, when I observed, you don't mention disabilities, oh, that's social justice. It isn't the same. Heck, it's not. Anyway, leaving that aside for the moment, our guest today is someone I've been looking forward to chatting with for a while. And her name is Sydney Elaine Butler, and Sydney is in Canada. And she has formed a company, actually, called Accessible Creates. Sydney is very familiar with disability. She has some, and I'll leave that to her to talk about. But she brings an empathy and understanding, I think, that's extremely important, and that all of you will appreciate listening to. So let's get on with it. And Sydney, I want to welcome you to Unstoppable Mindset, and really glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
Well, it's my pleasure, and we're really glad that you're able to finally get here. We've been working on this for a while, and we've had to postpone a few times. Sydney's had one thing or another going on, but that's okay.
Mhm.
We are unstoppable, so we always find a way to succeed, right?
Exactly.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit maybe about the early Sydney growing up and some of those things?
Yeah,
Always a good place to
so
start at the beginning, right?
oh, where do I start? So growing up, I first knew I had a speech impediment. And so I couldn't say my R's properly. And sometimes I would speak too fast, sometimes still do. Tell me to slow down if I need to. But and sometimes I wouldn't speak because I was too scared to say my R's wrong and to speak too quickly. And so I had to go to speech therapy from a young age and didn't understand that it was really different, I just realized that I was like, oh, my other classmates aren't leaving class to go do this, but it was my normal and it's what I knew. I also walked on my tippy toes a lot. So then I had to start going to physical therapy. And I was also playing soccer. And my parents put me in a lot of different things to get me active and to get out there. And then we also have the Girl Guides of Canada, which is like equivalent to Girl Scouts in America. And so I joined that. And that's when I started to really find my voice and find what I'd like to do and start becoming more outgoing and starting to explore different things.
Ah, okay. Um, so was the speech impediment a manifestation of something else or what?
Yeah, so my dad also had a speech impediment growing up. I think it was just, it wasn't, I think in hindsight, it was tied to my neurodivergency, but didn't really know what that meant at the time. And at the time, we've seen us separate and knew that I, I think a lot of people think that like speech impediments or something you grow out of, and think a lot of people think, oh, a lot of kids have speech impediments.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes now it still manifests as I stutter sometimes because then my brain goes too fast and my mouth can't catch up.
Yeah.
And so just realizing that my brain thinks a little differently. And I think that had a part to play in it.
Well, so um, along the way, you discovered that you were also involved with other disabilities, I guess.
Yes. And so I think I kind of had depression when I was in high school. And so I think that led to me not knowing, if I wanted to be alive or not, frankly.
Mm.
And so that to other disabilities and understanding that all these different things. So like I feel like I had to almost do the camouflage and blend into, like, for example, I say I would hang out with the nerds and be more nerdy, or hang out with the jocks and be more of a jock. And I didn't really have a sense of self. And I think that played a role in that, in my mental health and being having other disabilities.
How did your parents handle all of that?
I think they just treated me as, I'm their child, and they for example, they would want me to go into speech therapy. Oh, I need physical therapy now because I'm walking my tippy toes and my calves were too tight. And so they just did the best they could and tried, a lot of people, I think they never tried to make you know that I was different. It just, okay, this is what City needs to do the best that he can. And so I am very thankful for them for that because I never felt like I was different. I just knew I needed to get different things to be successful, but I didn't really know the details and the depth of what was
Hmm.
happening.
When did you figure all of that out, or when did doctors or whatever finally come up with a
Mhm.
diagnosis that made sense?
Yeah, I think when shortly after I started college and I was like I was still living at home, but realizing that kind of becoming more independent, seeing that I could do some things I could do really well and other things I was struggling with, and then going to the doctors, explaining the things I was experiencing, and really understanding that, oh, okay, this I'm not, finding out what is happening with me and how to best help myself and help and being patient with myself because I think a lot of times you can get so frustrated because you don't know exactly what's wrong, but you know something's wrong. And so I
Hmm.
think by getting that help from the doctors and getting help, even just expressing my limitations, and also I was at the same time I was also helping kids, teens, and adults with disabilities, and I related to them so much. And so I think that's what prompted me to go to the doctors in the first place and be like, I relate more to this population. Why is this? And why am I so good at my job working with these individuals? Meanwhile, others that I felt like I was like don't. And so just seeing that, oh yeah, that makes more sense. That, autistic and all these different things that make up who I am.
Right. So how long ago was it that you were in college?
I was in college. I started in 2015 and I
Okay.
graduated in 2018. And then I went to university from 2018 to 2020 because my college actually the university offered a degree completion program. And so that was really beneficial.
So you were fairly recent in the process. I've had some
Yes.
people on Unstoppable Mindset who were in their 30s before someone was able to accurately diagnose that they were
Hmm.
different because they had autism. Um,
Hmm.
and I know that it is, for example, autism. And I know that for the longest time, people just didn't know how to understand it or describe it. So at least in a sense, I guess, although it still took a while for
Hmm.
them to figure out with you, still it was better that it happened now than years ago when they weren't able to explain it or even really understand it.
Yeah, and I think this is misconception that I think previously in the years, like you said, it was more like there was very specific criteria around what
Yeah,
they thought autism was, but now
right.
we understand it's a spectrum and how it impacts, people that, males versus females, and so I think it's like, oh, the lack of empathy is seen associated with autism. But like you said at the beginning, I have lots of empathy, and I think I have hyper empathy, which actually is a thing in females that are autistic.
Mm, okay. So what did you get your college and university degrees in?
Yeah, so I studied business administration, human resources. So my aunt actually, she was human resources on a cruise ship, and I thought at first when I was applying for university and in college, at college first because I thought I was actually going to be an environmentalist because high level I've always wanted to change the world. So I thought, with climate change and global warming, I was like, oh, I want to be an advocate and talk about, what's it better do to help the planet. But I didn't have the math grades for that.
Ah,
That wasn't one of my strong suits. And so, but also took business as an elective in school. It's like, oh, this seems like an interesting elective. I'll take it. And I actually did quite well in it. And I like people and helping people. And I thought, human resources, even though we know they mostly help the employer, I could also help people in the workplace. And there's so many different diverse aspects of human resources. And so that's why I decided to study human resources in school.
You just avoided the math part of business, huh?
There was still math in business, but it's funny because I actually took statistics during my college, and that math made a lot of sense to me. It was like my brain. I became a statistics tutor actually, and it was so funny seeing the 180 of how I did math in high school versus how I was now doing math while also paying for college now.
Well, at least you made it through,
Yes.
which is pretty cool. So when you got out of college and university, what did you do? How soon? Well, let me just ask, what did you do? Let's start with that.
So I graduated from university in 2020, December. And so that was quite a challenge, um, as you can imagine, because I was actually supposed to have an internship that summer, and then the world shut down.
Mhm.
And I remember I had an interview on my mom's birthday, March 18th, which is the day the world shut down. And then they sent me an email that Friday and said if it wasn't for the pandemic, for what's the COVID variant of the COVID virus that's going around, you would be getting this job. They said that to me. But unfortunately, now we're closing our doors because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And that was very frustrating because I was like, I could have had this traditional, and it was an HR position mixed with statistics. And I just mentioned my love of statistics. And so it was going to be perfect. Right. But it didn't happen. And so then I had another interview the last week of before I graduated from my degree. And again, they said if you just had a little bit more experience in human resources, you would have got the job. And I was like, if I got that job back when I had the internship, I would have got this job. And I was very
Hmm.
frustrated. But I didn't let that stop me. I was like, okay, what kind of HR jobs do I want to have? What impact do I want to leave on human resources? Because right now the market is a mess. A lot of people are losing their jobs that don't have jobs, and a lot of companies are still closed from the pandemic because we're still very much in the thick of it in December of 2020. And so I started attending human resource webinars, volunteering with other. We actually have a local HR association here where you can get your designation from, and I was part of it, and I got a discount because I was a student not too long ago. And started volunteering with them, seeing how I could assist. And then they actually had a big conference, and I met someone there that helped him. He had to take down 500 emails. He's like, "Oh, can you take down 500 emails? Because we're not going to finish this webinar in time. Can you take down 500 emails?" And I'm there cuddling with my new COVID puppy in bed because I didn't have to have my camera on, just taking down all the emails. He's like, "Oh, can you send it to me?" And so I sent him the email. And so I actually worked at the HR startup he had for a little bit because he messaged me. He's like, "I'm impressed that you took down this email so fast. Do you want to come work at an HR startup with me?" And at the time, new grad, wanted to get my feet wet, wanted to see what happens. And so I joined there. But he was bootstrapping. And so he could only pay me peanuts, basically. And I was also, he's like, I encourage you to still look for traditional work, but you can also getting some experience here. And so I did that. And then I actually applied for a summer job, virtually, remotely, for a nonprofit organization called Skills for Change. And I was like, I'm passionate about accessibility and disability inclusion and HR and human resources. And I was their HR clerk for 8 weeks because the Canadian government actually paid for it. They have a Canada Summer Jobs program, but they gave funding. And I made the recruitment process more accessible. During a wellness session, I talked about Disability Pride Month because I was there during Disability Pride Month. And really, then I posted that on LinkedIn, and someone reached out saying, "Hey, do you want to come speak about neurodiversity in the workplace? I saw your presentation that you posted on LinkedIn." And I was like, okay. So I did that. And I really liked doing presentations. And so then I realized I could do more by starting my own company. I applied for a traditional job still, but I was like, maybe I can get my foot in the door by starting my own company, doing little trainings about HR and disability inclusion, neurodiversity. What does that look like? And yeah,
So so that's how you started Accessible Creates?
it was kind of informally starting Accessible Creates, just like it was kind of like planting the seed, I say. But then it was just like I also I was like, maybe I can make like wellness bracelets as well, and like make all these different things, make fidget toys, and have all these different components. And then it kind of branched off to, okay, I can do presentations. Oh, I can. People are also looking for consultants that have my unique skill set to look at policies and procedure, to look at job descriptions. And so it kind of took off into a world of its own.
All right. Well, and so you're you're still doing it.
Yes, it's going to be 3 years, a month from today, actually, on
Wow.
August 31st.
Wow. It'll be how long on August 31st?
3 years. 3
3 years,
years.
which is cool. Well, so you're obviously having some good success with it.
I feel very lucky, but I'm also like the amount of no's you get as a business owner, or someone just trying to put your services out there, like this is what I have to offer. And some people, oh, you're so lucky you get all these opportunities. I'm like, the amount of people that say no to me, or the things you don't see behind the scenes. And so just keeping at it and building my network and building my connections is so important. And so, and finding people, I think sometimes as business owners and entrepreneurs, we want to help everyone, but we can't help everyone,
Right.
right? And so finding that niche of just, okay, who can I really support here in this area?
So what are you finding are the areas or the kinds of places where you specialize?
Yeah, I find like, because again, I have that human resources background. And so leveraging that, I think it's funny because when I first started it, I was like, okay, I'm going to do, I was kind of advertising as I have HR knowledge with, like, I also have this expertise of disability, understanding disability inclusion, accessibility, and neurodiversity. And now it's kind of been like, now people are like, oh, you're the neurodiversity person that talks about neurodiversity here in Canada, or talks about disability inclusion. I'm like, I can also do human resource consulting. They're like, oh, we need an HR consultant, but we want to sprinkle in those other things. And so people that are looking for that niche is really cool and really impactful. And also looking at policies and procedures, I think is because it's a huge undertaking, and so finding the niche of clients that they know they need to modify the policies and procedures, but they're just kind of overwhelmed and don't know where to start. And so that's where I come in.
Yeah. And so you're able to help create policy or modify policy. And
Yes.
what's what's probably, would you say, the biggest misconception that you have encountered when you're dealing with companies regarding the whole idea of disabilities?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception is that it's only the entry level position that people with disabilities want jobs, and especially because actually most people with disabilities are actually more likely to get post-secondary education and to continue getting educated. And so it's really interesting to see the bias that employers have against people with disabilities and think, oh, you get this funding from the government to help pay people with disabilities that can't work, but that's not enough money. They're like, oh, that's enough money. You can live on that. You can't live on that.
Yeah.
And really understanding that if someone wants to work, they should be able to work, and that accommodation is not you getting more to do your job. It's leveling the playing field to make sure you can do your job and be successful at your job. And everyone deserves that.
And how are you able to change attitudes and perceptions about that?
Yeah, I really kind of challenge like, oh, what do you currently think of disability? And really making them think internally. I'm like, you don't have to say it out loud. You don't have to, just getting them thinking, so why do you have this misconception of disability? What disability representation have you seen in media? Right. And
Yeah.
so what really challenging what they think of when they think of disability. And so I remember I was actually talking about HR strategy and accessibility strategy and merging them together at a conference I spoke at last year. And I was like, oh, I left my cane at home. You can't tell today. And there was such, because it would kind of like they were paying attention, but they weren't like fully paying attention. You can tell when people aren't fully paying attention. So I made that joke, and then everyone was kind of like, there was like a little bit of laughter and silence, and then they were completely interested. It's like, okay, they're like, oh yeah, wait, why did I, have this misconception of what a disability looks like? And so it's like, let's get into it.
And at least then you're able to open the discussion.
Hmm.
You know, I've talked about it on Unstoppable Mindset a few times, but I have a different definition of disability than most people. And I'll explain very briefly.
Hmm.
People keep saying to me, well, disability, I say disability doesn't mean a lack of ability. And they say, well, of course
Hmm.
it does, because disability starts with dis. And I say, well, okay, but what about disciple, discern, discrete, and so on? They all start with dis, and they're not negative. No, disability isn't a lack of ability. And over the last year, a few things have happened that caused me to come up with a different definition, and mainly it came about because I was at a hotel in Hollywood, California last year at 3 in the afternoon when we lost power in and
Hmm.
around the hotel. And suddenly everybody started to scream, and they're running around trying to find or reaching for
Hmm.
flashlights and smartphones and so on. And I realized disability is something that everyone has. Sighted people have a disability, and their
Hmm.
disability is they're light dependent. And the reality is that we need to recognize that, in fact, everyone has a disability. Every single person with eyesight has the disability of being light dependent. Now, at the same time, you cover up your disability because Thomas Edison invented the electric light bulb, and we have worked so hard to create light on demand that disabilities are covered up. The disability of light dependence is covered up. It is until it can't be because suddenly the power goes out or whatever. But the reality is everyone in this world has a disability. The thing is that disability is a characteristic that manifests itself differently for different people. It doesn't mean, though, that you don't have it. Of course, most sighted people won't necessarily buy into that until suddenly they're stuck without light for a good period of time. It doesn't change the fact, though, that their disability gets covered up.
That's a very good point, Michael. I think again that what is a perception of what a disability actually is, and how someone interacts with it, and then how it impacts how someone shows up in the world and how the world views them. And so I think really understanding that, again, it's a spectrum, it impacts, and then this is so many different types of disabilities,
Mm-hmm.
and what does it actually mean to be disabled?
Well, and that's exactly it. That's why I use the definition that everyone has a disability. It's
Hmm.
just that it manifests itself differently for
Hmm.
different people. And we need to start to recognize that. And if we really intellectually recognize that, then we begin to change our thought about what a disability is and recognize that maybe it has nothing to do with how well people think or how well people can work. We just need to use and find alternatives when necessary. I mean, look at most buildings, office buildings. They have lights so that people can see where
Hmm.
to go to walk down a corridor, or they have windows people can look out, or sometimes open for heat or whatever. But typically, they don't necessarily open. But they have a lot of different kinds of things to accommodate light dependent people. Computer monitors, but they won't necessarily buy a screen reader for a person who is blind, even though that screen reader might not even cost as much as a monitor today. You have coffee machines that are touchscreen. We provide so many accommodations for employees based solely on eyesight, for example, or right-handedness, or any number of
Hmm.
other kinds of things. And we really need to learn as a society to move beyond that. But that's where the challenge is, of course, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's a it's like we're constantly making accommodations or making adjustments or making things easier for humans, and how does accessibility play a role in that, and making sure that everyone has the ability to access what they need to access and to do it the best way they can.
So how would you, and of course I've perhaps messed this up by coming up with the definition of disability that I did, but how would you find accessibility? How would you define it today?
I feel like disability is more like, I feel like people think it's like the medical condition you have or the experience you have, but I really think it's like the barriers that people put in place, and like the editorial barriers, someone's biases towards someone that looks different or appears different, the barriers to accessing different tools and different resources, and really understanding that disability can be permanent, it can be temporary, it can be situational, kind of like you were getting at with that everyone has a disability, and that it looks different every day, and that there's no one size fits all to
Right.
have a disability, and that it really is a spectrum.
So then how would you find accessibility?
Yeah, so I think accessibility is synonymous for a lot of people, for people have providing access for people with disabilities. But I define accessibility as allowing people to have the resources they need to do their day to day or to be successful, regardless of have a disability or not.
Right. And um, it's all about education, isn't it?
Yes.
So in the HR world,
Mhm.
what could HR do, and how can we deal with making human resources more accessible and inclusive for people with disabilities?
I think right now, human resources, HR is trying to really, look, we want to recruit more people with disabilities, we want to hire more people with disabilities, but understand that there's 25%, only 25% of people that have disability actually disclose in the workplace that they have a disability and disclose to human resources that they have a disability. And
Hmm.
meanwhile, there's probably a lot more than that in the organization and in the workplace. And so we looking, okay, what do your retention strategies look like for developing people that have, disabilities? Why is, looking at management? Why is it, oh, you're doing good at this job, let's promote you to management. Okay, not everyone wants to become a manager, or it doesn't, have the skills to become a manager. Okay, what are other approaches you can use to develop an employee? How can you look at your culture to evaluate how people with disabilities are treated and how they feel? Is in finding out where those gaps are most people with disabilities having those issues with management because management's not understanding how to better accommodate and support employees with disabilities? Is it the coworkers making that experience? Is it human resources themselves causing these issues? And really figuring out where the issues lie with that particular organization, and learning how to better increase retention.
So what do you do with Accessible Creates and so on to really help in the education process and to helping with truly having more of a higher retention for persons with disabilities?
Yes, so I, for example, audit the policies and procedures, see how they regards to accessibility, there have any language around accessibility, because a lot of organizations, there's the ADA in America, and they have that in their policies and procedures. Meanwhile, the ADA is just the bare minimum and just covering to make sure you don't get a lawsuit. But what are the best practices you're actually implementing? Do you have an accommodation policy and procedure so people know how they can be accommodated, and managers, human resources know how to best accommodate that employee? And then also I also provide coaching. So providing coaching if, for example, for the neurodivergent or disabled employee, and they need a bit more assistance knowing how to better advocate for their rights and advocate for themselves in the workplace. So also working in conjunction, doing a management training on, okay, if your employee comes to you with this information, what do you do, and how to address that, and how to make sure that someone feels safe enough to disclose or disclose that they need support from you to better do their job.
Yeah. How do you deal with the employer or even someone in HR, but somebody in authority at a company that says, well, yeah, you raise good points and we'll implement them, but it takes time. We just can't
Mhm.
jump into it.
Yeah, I say, like good things take time. Um, but really understanding that I think a lot of times, sometimes they scared to make the wrong choice and make the wrong decision. But I think also just like by not doing anything and not taking the time to do things take time. We all know this, and being able to be transparent with the employees. Hey, we're implementing this thing. Because I think a lot of times management or human resources are doing these good initiatives, but they're not communicating that to the fellow employees what's being done. And so I think just being transparent and being able to be flexible and be open with, the employees and being honest.
Yeah. Um, it is hard because people really tend to think that we got to move slow. But the reality is, if you don't take the leap and start recognizing you're treating some people in a substandard way and make the conscious effort to change it, um, then you won't. I mean, we have seen
Mhm.
so many shifts in the world. Smartphones came along and everyone adopted them very quickly because they saw the value of it. And uh, I've dealt with people who are interested in making their internet websites more accessible, and some of them say, "Well, we got to do it because if we don't, we'll get sued." And some people say, and rightly so, we've got to do it because it's the right thing to do. But when you then switch that to, well, what about hiring people with disabilities and so on? Or what about changing attitudes within your organization? It's, well, that just takes more time. And I question whether it really should take more time, or should you really adopt a policy and then work to bring people up to it?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a mix of both. I think it's obviously it's going to take time, but also what are you putting in place to get it most efficiently and get it as quickly as possible to make it as much people understand, to really break down those barriers and to get people having these discussions and having these conversations and just challenging what the norm was in the organization. And what's a why do we have these preconceptions of what disability is in the workplace and disability inclusion? And things are going to take time, and that's okay. But really understanding, okay, how are you setting yourself and your organization up for the best success to better support all people in the organization.
And that's really the issue, isn't it? Because it's all about conversation, it's all about education.
Hmm.
And the biggest problem I see in general in terms of dealing with people with disabilities within organizations or anywhere, with the law, with whatever, is that we just don't engage in the conversation. And probably some of that is fear. Oh my gosh, I don't want to become blind like them, and it could happen to me. I got to avoid that. Or um, any other disability. I might end up in a wheelchair. I don't want to do that. And so there is a level of fear that enters into it, but also it is just having the conversation and starting to really make people more aware of what disabilities really are and what they're not, and doing more of a concerted effort to make that conversation happen, I think will do more to help educate and get people to move and realize maybe our attitudes and our ideas aren't what we thought they should be.
Yeah, and it's like understanding why is there that fear, you know? It's like, is it because of what how media portrays it? It's because of what stories you've heard, and we all have our different struggles. Going back to your point about you said, we all have disabilities in some ways. We all have different struggles. We're all human beings. We all have good and bad days. And so, what does the fear stem from? And
Hmm.
people, a lot of people are scared to say the wrong thing, but the worst thing you can say is nothing at all.
Right.
And and so I think like, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing about disability. I don't want to get, the cancel culture or whatever they call, these days.
Yeah,
And so it's just like the worst thing you can do is not say anything because you're stagnating your own growth and the organization's growth by not even wanting to make those mistakes. And the difference between intention and impact. It's gonna maybe so impact someone if you say the wrong thing, but be like, hey, I'm learning. Even if you're management or human resources, I'm learning every day. I'm gonna make mistakes, and again, that transparency piece is so important because we all know we're humans. We're gonna make mistakes, and I think sometimes an organization they really put managers and human resources on a pedestal that isn't shouldn't be the case because again, we're all human at the end of the day. We're all we're here to do a job and we're gonna make mistakes and that's okay. And so really coming off the pedestal, be like, I'm learning, I want to do better, how and being vocal and being transparent about that is so crucial.
I think you raise a really good point, and I think that the issue is, as you said, saying nothing is the worst thing that you can do. But I also think whether some of us who have disabilities in the traditional
Hmm.
sense of the word, if I'm going to use that,
Hmm.
some of us don't want to be teachers. We're tired of having
Yeah.
to explain. But the reality is, we are the best teachers. We are,
Hmm.
or we're the best information providers. And we really should understand and be patient, because if we know that really people behave as they do because it's an educational issue and they haven't got the education, who's in a better position than we are to address that? And
Hmm.
so I agree with what you're saying. One of the things that I hear all the time is, well, you're visually impaired, which I think is the worst thing that anyone can say about anyone who has any kind of eyesight issue. We're not visually impaired. Visually, we're not different.
Hmm.
We're not visually different, and impaired, we are not. It's like deaf people have learned,
Hmm.
if you say deaf or hearing impaired, they're liable to execute you on the spot. They
Hmm.
recognize that it's deaf or hard of hearing. And slowly, although not nearly fast enough, um, blind people are starting to learn visually impaired is the wrong thing to say, because it contributes to the lack of understanding,
Hmm.
because you say impaired and we're not. Blind and
Hmm.
low vision is a lot more relevant, and certainly
Hmm.
not negative. But if we aren't willing to help educate, then we're doing our own disservice to all of us.
Yeah, I think to your point that, it's like sometimes we're tired of explaining things and don't want to advocate but it's like we're the best teachers and but also giving that space to it's like, do you want to share? Do you want to talk about your experiences? Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel up to talking about it? Hey, I don't feel like talking about it right now. I'm just a little time.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
should be okay. Or another time, oh, I'm willing to educate you today and explain my experiences to you. And so I think there's sometimes too much pressure that of people like, oh, I always say, I'm like, ask people questions. People want to answer your questions, but if they don't have capacity, you don't have the energy to answer your questions. That's okay. Be like,
Yeah,
hey, another time, and be okay with that.
yeah.
And I think just giving, as human beings, giving each other compassion and giving each other that grace is so important to drive this work forward.
Well, I think it is important to find a mutually agreeable time, and maybe that's part of the discussion. Is I
Hmm.
really would rather not talk about this now. Can we set up a time to talk about it? And
Hmm.
and working toward that, I think, is extremely important to be able to do, because we are going to be, by definition, the best educators in terms of disabilities. And um, you can also get different people with a disability who will say different things. There are still some people
Hmm.
who like visually impaired, but that's what the professionals have ingrained in us. And it's a process to get that out of our psyche and recognize that it's low vision, and blind, not visually impaired.
Hmm.
I would prefer just blind for anyone who has lost enough eyesight that they have to use alternatives to print to be able
Mhm.
to function. I would prefer just to use blind, but the reality is that's probably a larger step than most people are willing to take today. So blind and low vision works for a while, but at some point, we're going to have to recognize there's nothing wrong with being blind, or there's
Mhm.
nothing wrong with being in a wheelchair, or there's nothing wrong with being deaf, or being a person somewhere on the autism spectrum. There's nothing wrong with
Mhm.
any of those. It's just that we're going to do things differently than you're used to.
Yeah, I think language is so important too because like what the professionals say, what all the research is saying, but it's like what does that person identify with? What do they identify and what is their experience like? And really
Yeah.
talking to them it's like, and I think a lot of times we even when we're educated, like, this is my personal experience. This is how I want to identify with as a person with a disability, or I identify as a disabled person. We preface that. And so I always make this joke. I'm like, people are like, oh, do I say he's visually impaired? Do I say, he's low vision? Do I say he's blind? It's like, well, his name's Michael, so call him Michael.
Yeah, and you can always ask. Yeah,
Hmm.
but his name is Michael, and that's really the issue. Um, one of the discussions that I've been involved with of late is sort of related to the whole first person language. It's about
Hmm.
descriptions. I notice in your bio you have a description: long blonde, brown curly hair, wearing a silver necklace and a red blouse. What do you think about the whole concept of providing or needing to provide descriptions, especially if you're in a meeting with people who don't see?
Yeah, I think it's important. And I think, and asking the person, do you want a description? I think,
There you go.
um, I think sometimes by people want to just if it's politically acceptable, but really talking to the person, hey, do you need a bigger description of me? But what would make you feel most comfortable? Even just asking that to anyone, what can I do in this meeting to make you feel most comfortable? What do you require of me to get the best experience out of this? And so just asking the person.
And that's really the key, isn't it? There's
Hmm.
nothing wrong with asking. Personally, I don't need descriptions. Now, I've
Hmm.
never been able to see with eyes,
Hmm.
so it's never been an issue for me. But I do know that there are people who have become blind later in life who may want descriptions, and that's fine. The other side of it is it really going to add value, say, to a meeting?
Hmm.
That is, does a description of a person really make you more comfortable? And I don't know the answer to
Hmm.
that for a lot of people. I do know for me, um, it just takes time away from the meeting. But that's me, and I
Yeah.
understand that.
Hmm.
Um, one of the reasons I brought it up was that a couple of weeks ago I was involved in a meeting, and after the meeting, one of the people wrote to everyone who was there and said, I went online trying to find descriptive words for people with disabilities to provide those same descriptions for people with disabilities, but I can't find them. And most of us said, why do you need them?
Hmm.
Because the reality is, there are a lot of different disabilities. There's no one real answer. And I do agree that we shouldn't hide who we are, but we can take this descriptive symbolism and beat it to death so often too. Does it really make sense to have descriptors of people with a disability?
Yeah, I think it's like who is the person, getting and what does that look like? And so I think understanding that I feel like there's so many things and so much information coming out about disability right now, how to be most inclusive, that sometimes we forget the nuance of just the human
Yeah.
experience. And yeah.
Well, and that's what we essentially told the person who asked the
Hmm.
question, that it's not, and a number of people did, it's
Hmm.
not really relevant
Yeah.
um, to do it for disabilities as such. Um, but I think your point is also well taken. you can always ask. And if
Mhm.
somebody wants a description, then give them a description and then move on. But it is something that I've been in meetings and I've heard way too often. You'll have 10 or 12 people in the meeting and they're asked without finding out whether people want it. When you first speak, give a description of yourself. By the time you're done with that, you've wasted another 10 or 12 minutes of the meeting, which is only an hour long anyway.
Mhm.
And what have you really gained from that? And again, I understand that there are some people who might like that because they used to see. Um, but I think that we can take it to an extreme, which doesn't help.
Yeah, I think really understanding what are the needs of what's the reason behind the meeting? What are the needs of the meeting? Who's
Yeah,
attending the meeting? Do they do they do people need it? Do they not need it? And again, providing even like for example, closed captions. Who be like, I think closed captions are so important. And the thing a
yeah,
lot of people are like, oh, it's for people only people that are hard of hearing. And but it's like, for example, sometimes it's like, oh, it's better for me to process information if I see it written instead of just hearing it or hearing it and seeing it. And so it's like, what is it adding to the meeting instead of,
yeah,
and really, what's the value?
and things like closed captioning, I absolutely can understand, and I think that
Hmm.
meetings should have closed captions, and I don't care what the meeting is.
Hmm.
We should get into that habit.
Hmm.
Um, and the other thing I would say is that um, again, descriptions are a different situation because
Hmm.
what does it really add to the meeting? And but again, some people may really want it. So it's a question to ask and then
Hmm.
go from there. But I would say closed captions. Another one is one of my favorites. Somebody created this terminology, no braille, no meeting. That is to say, especially when a blind person, for example, is involved. But I would say in general, it would be better to do this. And that is if you're going to have a meeting, don't bring handouts to the meeting. Disseminate them in advance because if you have a meeting and you're giving people handouts and you're talking, they've got to split their time between listening to you and reading the
Hmm.
handout. And I don't care what handout it is, you could take a few minutes early enough to disseminate handouts so that people can all be prepared. But especially that works for people like me who aren't going to read those handouts because you're going to create them from a copier anyway, or you're going to print them in a multiple way, but probably don't have access to a braille embosser or some way to get them to me. And so the reality is that documentation should be provided in advance. And I think, again, it's a habit that we should all get into. Then we don't have to worry about it when somebody comes along who really needs to have
Hmm.
those services.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I started doing that a couple years ago. It was like, why even for myself, I like to be okay. What's the agenda? I like to know the agenda, know what we're going to talk about, and so I have knowing that ahead of time is so important. And we all have such busy lives, so even if you don't have a like you said traditional disability, it's going to help you better prepare for that meeting and feel more at ease going into that meeting and going into this conversation. And it helps everyone at the end of the day.
Sure, it does. Were you ever treated poorly or have any real challenges because of the fact that you have a disability?
Yeah, I think a lot, like I mentioned in the beginning, my speech impediment, I think people would make fun of the way I would speak. And so, and I was just like, I don't talk like that, even, and that made me feel very uneasy. And then also going back to, dealing with depression in high school, people didn't understand really what it was to have depression. And so like, oh, it's just all in your head. Or like, and then I would kind of do some kind of reckless thing because I didn't, like I said, I didn't care if I lived or died. And so they were like, oh, and kind of make fun of me and or use it to their advantage to put me in other situations that were not the best for me. And so this also led to complex PTSD. And so just understanding that when sometimes people don't fully understand something, they're more likely to make fun of you, and not because again, the impact versus intent, right? So sometimes they're just kids being silly and not knowing really what they're doing, but sometimes in that malicious attack of using someone's disability against them.
Right. As you may know, um, I worked in the World Trade Center and escaped
Yes.
after on September 11th after the buildings were hit, and people even to this day say to me, um, "Well, you didn't know what happened, did you?" And I said, "No, not at the time." "Well, of course you didn't because you couldn't see it." They revert to that type, even though in
Hmm.
reality, the building where it was struck was 18 floors above us on the other side of the building. And so
Hmm.
one of the things that I say to people is, well, the last time I checked, Superman and X-ray vision are fiction. And the fact of the matter is, on my side of the building, no one knew what happened. When we were going down the stairs, not one single person anywhere around us knew what happened
Hmm.
because they were all on the other side of the building from where the plane was hit and typically many floors below where the plane was hit. So of course, nobody saw it, but they want to revert to type when it comes to dealing with, say, a
Hmm.
person who's blind. Well, of course, you couldn't see it, so you wouldn't know. And that is just unfortunate because, again, I think it contributes or comes from the lack of education.
Yeah, I think a lot of the whenever someone says something, sometimes it's just like it comes to that misunderstanding, that and the lack of education, and that's why education is so important in disability or talking about anything, because and sometimes I feel like people almost let like the fear or the unknown fill in those gaps, and it can cause huge problems.
Yeah. What is one thing that you wished people knew? Well, it's really two questions. One about disabilities, and the other is about accessibility.
Mhm. I think I wish what people knew about disabilities is that I think really that's a spectrum and that impacts people differently and can impact the individual themselves differently every day. Again, for example, if I didn't get enough sleep, it could contribute to other environmental factors that make my conditions act up. And for accessibility, I think that yes, accessibility is synonymous with people with disabilities and giving resources to people with disabilities, but accessibility allows us all to have the resources and the tools we need to be successful, and that it's kind of the bare minimum of what
Yeah,
we should be doing.
yeah. um, and I think for me, um, if there were one thing I wish people knew about disabilities is it's okay to ask. It's
Yes.
okay to want to know more. And I always will, if people ask me a question, I will answer it. One of the things that I encounter often is I'll be anywhere from an airport to a hotel to a store, and a child wants to come up and pet my guide dog. And the parents will say, "Oh, don't go pet that dog. That dog might bite. You don't know anything about that dog." As opposed to saying, um, it's a guide dog and the dog is working. Now, some people do say that, but a lot of people don't. For me, my policy is if I hear a child asking, especially when parents respond
Mhm.
in the negative way, I will always stop, take the harness off, and say, "No, it is okay. They can visit with the dog." And then it gives me the chance to say, when the harness is on, the dog is working. It's got a job to do because the dog
Mhm.
makes sure that I walk safely. But the dog isn't going to bite you, and I don't want you to be afraid of dogs just because. But you should always ask. It's okay to ask and do that. I think that's really important. But oftentimes parents continue to create a fear level that we don't need to have. So if a child wants to interact with my dog, I will always stop. If an adult wants to, if I have time, I will stop. And if I don't, I will not stop and I'll say, here's why I'm in a hurry. I've got to get here. I really don't have time. I wish I
Mhm.
did. But I will, whenever I can, I will stop and let people interact. I'll take the harness off because the dog needs to relax too. And the dog knows when the harness comes off, they can visit and they know that they're supposed to focus. But even so, when somebody pets a dog, even in harness, they're going to look because the dog really likes the attention. So it's
Mhm.
a matter of dealing with it. But by the same token, the bottom line is that I think again it's all about education. So I don't mind letting people pet the dog, but only when the harness is off. And I've had a couple of times that people would ask, and I say, not right this moment, and then they go right ahead and pet the dog. And I know that they
Mm.
pet the dog because the dog is looking and I can feel the leash move. And when that happens, I will give the dog not a hard one, but a leash correction saying, leave it. And the people will say, oh, don't yell at the dog. I was the one that was petting the dog. I said, no, you don't understand. You got the dog in trouble. The dog knows better. I'll deal with the dog, then
Mhm.
I'll deal with you. But it's an educational process.
Mhm.
But with kids, I'll always stop. I think it's important that children learn what guide dogs are and that they are friendly. The only thing I would say is I hope they're not holding an ice cream cone at the time because they'll lose the ice cream cone. What would you tell your teenage self if you could go back right now and do that?
Oh, I would tell my teenage self that be authentically you because, like I said, I felt like I was a chameleon in high school. And so by being more me, embracing my differences, embracing who I am, embracing all these different things that make up who Sydney is, and really leaning into that and also giving myself a little bit more grace and compassion because like I said, I could do some things and other things I couldn't do. And now understanding, okay, there is some things I can do and some things I can't do. And that's okay. And that I'm worthy and that I think that's it.
Okay. I think that's fair. Well, if people would like to reach out to you, maybe take advantage of your services and so on, and interact, how do they do that?
You can send me this. I have a form on my website that you can fill out, and
In the web, yeah.
my website is accessiblecreates.ca.
So accessiblecreates.ca. So they can go there and they can reach out and so on and take it from there.
Yes.
And they can write you and ask you all sorts of questions
If they choose.
if they choose. Well, Sydney, I want to thank you for being here. This has been a lot of fun um, and educational, and I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate your time. I'm glad we finally were able to make this happen. And I hope all of you out there come away with a little bit of a different view of disabilities and all of us who typically experience that than you had before. Love to hear your thoughts. Love to get an idea of what you think. Please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me at michaelhi@accessibe.com. That's michaelhi @accessibe.com. Or you can go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. And Michael Hingson is spelled michaelhingson.com/podcast. Wherever you're listening or watching on YouTube, please give us a 5-star rating. We value your ratings and would really appreciate you taking the time to rate and comment. We love your comments. We love getting your feedback. And so would definitely appreciate you doing that. If you know of anyone who ought to be a guest on our show, our podcast, and Sydney, including you, if you know anyone who ought to be a
Mhm.
guest, please let us know. Reach out, introduce us. We're always looking for people who want to become guests on Unstoppable Mindset. And so, with that, again, Sydney, I want to thank you for being here. This has been a lot of fun. Any last words that you want to say?
Yes, again, thank you so much, Michael, for having me on your podcast. And I look forward to seeing how, yeah, I look forward to keeping in touch and seeing other conversations that can come up.